Hello, my name is Irene, and this is the story of my romance with Harold. I'm 76 years old, and if I may be honest, I never imagined Sundays would become the hardest days of the week. When you're young, you're always rushing, distracted by the kids, the responsibilities, the social gatherings. But now, with the house so quiet and old photographs staring at me from the walls, time seems to move differently, slower, heavier. My children have their own lives, their children, their commitments, and that's okay. I raised them for the world, not to be tied to me. But there's a certain echo that takes over the house when the last "love you, Mom" is said over the phone. And in that echo, little by little, I began to lose myself. I remember once going into the kitchen and making 2 cups of coffee, only realizing afterward that I'd made 1 extra out of habit. I looked at the empty cup and smiled sadly. "You're getting forgetful, Irene," I said aloud, trying to laugh at myself. But the truth was, I just wanted company. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was emptiness, an absence too vague to name. It was on one of those afternoons, when the sky felt too heavy for my chest, that I decided I needed to move, not for adventure. I had plenty of those in my youth. Now it was for emotional survival. I needed to fill my days with something more than just waiting for the next phone call, the next visit. That's how I came across the embroidery workshop flyer on the pharmacy's bulletin board, a simple sheet of paper with delicate letters, embroidery classes for beginners. Rediscover the joy of creating with your hands. I read those words over and over, and something inside me whispered, "Go on, Irene. What do you have to lose?" The next day, I put on a blue polka dot dress that always made me feel pretty. I tied my hair up in a casual bun, like someone visiting an old friend. When I arrived at the studio, the air smelled of thread, wood, and paint. There were other women there, some with eyes full of life, others with the same kind of gaze I'd seen in the mirror that morning. "Good morning. You must be Irene?" "Welcome," said a kind, confident voice. I just smiled, a little shyly. "Yes, that's me. I think I might be a bit out of place, but I came to try." In that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was opening a new window, a small one, but with a view into something I didn't yet know how to name. And it was there, in that humble studio, that I began stitching the first threads of a new beginning I hadn't even known I needed. On my first day at the workshop, my hands trembled more than I'd like to admit. It wasn't just the nerves of being in a new place, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. It was the weight of time, of doubt, of the quiet insecurities that age brings, like someone sitting beside you without asking. "Have you embroidered before?" asked a sweet young woman, maybe 20 years younger than me. I shook my head, smiling faintly. "Just little tea towels for my mother, many years ago. But I think even the thread has forgotten me." I was handed a hoop, needles as thin as memories, and threads in soft shades of lavender, burgundy, and cream. I sat down slowly, trying to appear steady. Next to me, a lady was embroidering flowers with such delicacy, it seemed like she was having a conversation with the fabric. I took a deep breath. "Come on, Irene. It's just a thread going in and out, like leaving and returning to yourself." That's when I understood. Embroidery wasn't just a manual craft. It was a practice of presence. Every stitch demanded attention, patience, surrender. There was no room for rush, for distraction. And for the first time in a very long while, my mind went quiet. The thoughts that were always swirling stepped aside, giving space to the rhythmic silence of the needle passing through fabric, the gentle sound of the thread gliding, the focus in my fingertips. It felt like meditating with my hands. That afternoon, I made my first backstitch. It came out crooked, of course. "It looks beautiful," said a voice behind me, and when I turned, I saw the instructor, a tall gentleman with silver hair and a calm gaze. His voice sounded like the soft clink of a teacup being gently set on its saucer. "Embroidery, my dear, doesn't ask for perfection. It only wants truth." Those words stayed with me, like a thread I hadn't finished pulling through. I went home feeling a strange kind of lightness. It had been just one class, just one stitch, but something had shifted. That night I left, the television off, and just stared at my embroidery hoop. The mistakes, the small successes, the effort. It was more than learning to stitch. It was relearning how to care for myself. As the days passed, my stitches began to look steadier, more certain. And slowly, I wasn't just stitching fabric. I was piecing together scattered fragments of my story. Those moments in the studio gave me a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. There, I didn't have to be a mother, or a grandmother, or a widow. I was simply Irene, with my thread, my hoop, and a heart that, despite everything, still beat with a desire to create. I can't say exactly when I noticed it, but I know it didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like realizing the sun has risen without having looked directly at it. It was something in the way he listened. Yes, listened. And that, my dear, is a rare thing. Harold listened with his whole body, his eyes steady on mine, never reaching for a phone, never interrupting to tell a similar story, never rushing to end the moment. And before I go on and tell you how this all blossomed, if this story has touched your heart in any way, reminded you of someone, or made you want to believe in love again, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep sharing real and heartfelt stories like this one. And who knows, maybe inspire a new beginning on your side of the screen too. One day, I mentioned that I had planted new lilies in the garden, trying to bring some color to a backyard that had been just as faded as my days. It was just a passing comment, made between one stitch and the next. 2 weeks later, while we were working with thread and needles, he asked, "And the lilies? Did they bloom?" I paused. I had actually forgotten to notice. "Yes, they're blooming now. Some little white ones. Still a bit shy." He smiled softly. Shy flowers tend to be the toughest. They endure more than we expect. That's how he was. He said simple things with such beautiful weight, and he had this way of getting close without crossing any lines. When he adjusted my embroidery hoop beside me, his steady hands moved gently, as if they knew how to honor someone else's space. If you pull the thread too tight, the fabric wrinkles. You have to find the right tension. Not loose, not suffocating. I knew he was talking about embroidery, but I swear those words echoed in my mind like they were about me. During breaks when some of the women would step out for coffee, I always stayed behind a little longer. I'd say I wanted to finish the stitch, but the truth was, I just wanted to keep hearing that voice that made me feel accompanied without asking anything in return. We talked about little things, the weather, old recipes, vintage TV shows, but everything sounded deeper than it was. Maybe because it was honest, or maybe because it had been so long since anyone listened to me with such genuine interest. "You have a calm way about you, Irene," he said. One day, while threading the needle through a row of stitches, I was struggling to align. "But I can tell. There's a whole world inside that silence." I just smiled. I didn't know what to say. But inside, it felt like he had read me the way one reads a beloved book, the kind you keep by the bedside. It was different from anything I'd ever experienced. There were no rushed declarations, no promises, just presence, and that, at this stage in life, is worth more than any grand gesture. It felt good to know that there's still room for this kind of connection, that even with the wrinkles, with the years, with all the aches time leaves behind, it was still possible to be seen, and more than that, to be heard. And that's how I started to realize Harold wasn't like the other men who had passed through my life. He was different, because deep down, he wasn't trying to win me over. He simply saw me. It was one of those afternoons when the sky seemed to forget how to be blue. The rain was soft and steady, falling like it had no plans of leaving anytime soon. The sound of the drops on the studio roof mixed with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, old wood, thread, and fabric. Most of the women didn't show up that day. The sky had turned early, and let's be honest, age makes us a little more cautious about wet sidewalks. I almost didn't go myself, but something whispered, "Go, Irene." Sometimes it's in the stillness that life shows itself. When I walked into the room, he was the only one. There, Harold was calmly arranging materials, like someone who knew every inch of that space by heart. "Looks like it's just the two of us today," he said with a gentle smile. I nodded, slipping off my damp coat. I took my usual seat, beside the foggy window. "Maybe the rain scared away the distractions," I joked. He laughed, that kind of laugh that escapes like a secret. Sometimes what's left of the world is exactly what we need. We started stitching, each with our own hoop. But unlike the other days, there was silence. A silence that didn't weigh anything. It was almost comforting, like a blanket over your legs at the end of the day. Our hands moved in and out of the fabric, like two boats floating side by side. And it was there, between one stitch and the next, that our hands touched. At first, by accident, Then, for just a second longer than necessary, he looked at me, and I held his gaze, which I don't usually do. I felt a shiver, but not from the cold. It was like some long-forgotten part of me had just awakened. He didn't say anything. He simply turned my hand over gently, like someone handling something fragile. And then, without hurry, he brought his lips to the center of my palm. A simple gesture, almost innocent, but my God, how it pierced through me. It was as if my whole body suddenly remembered a warmth I'd forgotten existed. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the softness of the touch, his breath mingling with my skin. There was no rush, no promise, only truth. When I opened my eyes, he was still holding my hand. "I'm sorry, Irene. It was just impulse." I shook my head, smiling slowly. If it was the most beautiful impulse I've received in many years. That afternoon, something changed. Not just between us, but inside me. I discovered there was still a space in some quiet corner of my chest that could be lit up again. That even after all this time, the right touch could still awaken tenderness, desire, life. We sat in silence for a while longer, as if words weren't necessary, and maybe they weren't, because in that moment, between the rain tapping on the roof and the warmth of his hand in mine, everything had already been said, everything had already begun, even if we didn't yet know what to call it. After that rainy afternoon, I have to admit, my days took on a new rhythm. I still did my chores, still made my 5 o'clock tea, still watched the evening dramas, but something was different. A discreet sparkle in my eyes, a new lightness in my step, and at the same time, a silent storm within my chest. I was feeling something I hadn't felt in years, and I'm not just talking about touch, but about the desire to let myself feel again. And oh, how terrifying that is after 75. I spent days with that moment replaying in my mind, his hand in mine, the kiss to my palm, the silence that said everything. But then the thoughts came, those ones that never ask permission. Is this just loneliness? Am I fooling myself? What would my children think if they knew? It was as if all the certainty that age had given me was now replaced with questions I didn't know how to answer. One night, alone in my room, I looked at an old photograph. It was me, young, standing beside the father of my children. We looked like two kids dressed up in grown-up clothes. I felt warmth, nostalgia, respect, but I also realized something. I didn't want to relive the past. I wanted to live something new, with the heart I have now. More scarred, yes, but also much more willing to love with awareness. Can I still love after 75? I asked out loud, staring at my reflection in the mirror. And it felt like that question, hanging in the air, had been asked so I could answer it myself. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. Of course I can. Because love doesn't have an age. It just needs courage. The next day, Harold greeted me with that same calm smile. We didn't speak of the kiss. We didn't mention the rain. But something between us had shifted. The way he handed me the embroidery hoop. The gentle way he tucked a strand of hair away from my face. The way he said my name. Everything was filled with more intention, but no rush. I started to notice that, upon waking, the first thing I thought of was him. And it wasn't with teenage excitement, but with the tenderness of someone who's just found a long-lost piece of herself. I felt joy knowing I'd see him. And most of all, I felt like I didn't have to hide. Not from others, not from myself. I've lived through so much. I've been a daughter, a wife, a mother, a grandmother. I've cared. I've cried. I've loved deeply. But loving now, at this stage of life, has a different flavor. It's not about building castles. It's about opening windows and letting the light in. So yes, I can love after 75. And if anyone asks how I found the courage, I'll say, it's not courage. It's just the will to feel again. Because at the end of the day, the heart doesn't retire. It just waits to be called by name. And mine, since that day, has been called hope. It was on a clear Saturday afternoon, the kind where the breeze is soft and the sun doesn't bother you. I was finishing an embroidery of lavender, maybe out of memory, maybe out of longing for its scent. Harold appeared in the doorway of the studio holding a scarf and wearing that smile I could already recognize from far away. "Irene," he said, adjusting his glasses with that absent-minded gesture that always made me smile inside. "There's a little craft fair at the park today. I thought, if you'd be up for it, we could grab a coffee there. Just coffee and conversation. I promise." I took a few seconds to answer. Not because I was unsure, but because suddenly my heart was beating with the same rhythm it used to know in my youth. "I'd love to," I said, adjusting my purse with more care than usual. He smiled like someone who felt relief at not hearing a no, and off we went, walking, side by side to the park. No hurry, no plan. The fare was simple, full of colorful booths and the smell of cornbread mingling with handmade incense. He looked at me like someone watching the sunrise of a long-awaited day, and I felt light. "Do you like scarves?" he asked, pointing to a little booth overflowing with patterned fabrics. "That blue one reminded me of your eyes. My eyes are a little faded these days," I joked, but he replied with a firm, sweet tone, "They're not. They've just gotten deeper," and that's how I got my first gift from him. A blue scarf with tiny golden stitches, which he gently wrapped in my hands, as if offering more than just a piece of fabric. We sat on a bench under the shade of a tree and shared a slice of orange cake. He told stories from his youth about a trip he once took through the countryside of Brazil to study textile patterns, and laughed at his own jokes, always just a little before the punchline. It was an early kind of laughter, like someone who already knows the ending and loves it too much to wait. I laughed along, not so much at what he said, but because I enjoyed seeing him happy. At some point, without a word, he reached out his hand, and without thinking, I slid my fingers into his. A simple gesture, but one that made time slow down. We walked a little further, hand in hand, like two teenagers who had found each other again, in a world that always seemed too late for new beginnings. As we made our way back, he looked at me with that same calm way of his and said, "Thank you for accepting my invitation, Irene. Sometimes all we need is a beautiful afternoon to remember we're still alive." And I, with my new scarf around my neck and my heart warmed, could only reply, "Thank you, Harold, for reminding me I can still be invited." And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just a walk. It was the beginning of something that, even slowly, was blooming with the tenderness only time knows how to water. Sometimes I find myself staring at the embroidery hoop, even when I'm not stitching. I sit there, looking at that firm wooden circle holding some random piece of fabric, and I think this is where it all began. And I don't just mean the embroidery. It was right there, between uneven stitches and colored threads, that I discovered love, that old familiar, can, in fact, begin again, and that it can be born in silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that comforts, that embraces, the same silence that surrounded me whenever Harold sat beside me, not saying much, just being. I learned that mature love doesn't arrive with fireworks. It comes like a calm autumn afternoon, with the scent of fresh coffee and the soft sound of gentle rain. It doesn't demand. It doesn't rush. It simply exists, whole and patient. And that's exactly how I felt with him. Whole, even if imperfect. Seen, even in my quiet. Desired, even without promises. The conversations with Harold, always full of memories and thoughtful pauses, taught me that listening is an act of love, that there's beauty in sharing silence, in splitting a slice of cake, in walking slowly with fingers interlaced, as if the world had slowed down just to give us more time. Love didn't shout inside me. It whispered, with the voice of someone who's lived enough to know that time doesn't race. It walks beside us, if we let it. "Have you noticed how our stitches are firmer now?" he said to me once, as we adjusted our embroidery hoops. I looked at mine, full of intertwined threads, some wrong, others corrected, and I smiled. "I guess it's practice," I answered. But he looked at me with that quiet gaze of his and added, "Or maybe it's because now we're stitching with the heart." And that's what it is. Love, at this stage of life, isn't built on certainty. It's built on presence, on hands that hold without gripping, on eyes that don't ask for youth, but recognize the beauty of the stories etched into our faces. To love after 70 is to accept that time has passed, yes, but that it also left space for something new to bloom. Today, when I walk to the studio, I don't just carry my needle and thread. I carry with me the certainty that new beginnings can be sweet, that even after so many autumns, I can still live through spring, and that, in the quiet between two stitches, I found something I wasn't looking for anymore, a chance to be happy again, without noise, without frenzy, just with the peace of someone who embroiders her own story and discovers that love, when it's real, sounds exactly like thread passing through fabric, subtle, deep, and absolutely unforgettable. If this story touched you in any way, if it brought a smile, a tear, or even a quiet little sigh of, "I understand," then don't leave without giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Because every click you give helps me keep stitching together these stories that warm the heart and make life feel a little lighter. And who knows, maybe in the next video, it'll be your story that finds a home here too.